Geo, it's Adam Hoge. And from The Athletic, it's Adam Jahns.
It's one of the craziest games that I've covered live. That crazy.
I feel like, how many times a season do we say that?
Yeah, but this one,
I know.
In the red zone.
I'm not disputing what you're saying. I'm just like, how does this franchise keep doing that?
Anyway, who cares?
Here they are, the Adams, Hoge Jahns.
What's up? Welcome in. We got a special edition of Hoge Jahns this week as the Bears return from their bye week, as we do a crossover with our friends that do the Birds with Friends podcast. Bo Wulf, Zach Berman are here, and Kevin Fishbain's in for Adam Jahns because, well, Jahns had an eventful bye week, and he had a baby, beautiful Emily Catherine Jahns has entered the world, and I think I speak for everyone in saying, thank goodness it's a girl. Right, Kevin?
Yes, I think the Jahns family needed a girl, and happy for the family. Last I checked, everyone's doing well, and Johnsy said he's going to be at the game Sunday.
Yeah.
So
wow,
I don't know if he's going to do anything else for the next month, but he says he's going to be at the game Sunday.
As a fan,
hard to say.
Yeah. No, he did. I think Colleen gave him permission to still cover the game, but he's not going to be on the pod this week, and that's what
we know where his priorities are.
Sounds like a football guy.
Do we? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I guess. Yeah.
Would rather be at the football game than do the podcast.
Now, yeah, that's the question. Will he do the post-game pod after the game, or will he say, no, I got to get home to the baby?
Yeah, see, I feel like he's going to be very conveniently utilizing the baby excuse.
Well,
I shouldn't call it an excuse.
Well, he does have 4 kids now, right, Kev? We have to adjust our long-running joke about how many children he has.
He does.
It's not 4. Bo and Zach, thanks so much for jumping on with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, what's it like covering a good football team?
Zach, go ahead. You're the one who's already written a book about one, so.
It's a happy locker room. You know, that's what jumps out. There's less sniping. I don't know if sniping's the word. There's less griping
between you and I think is
yes. But honestly, it's one of these things too where at this point in the year, it's almost like fast forward to the playoffs, right? Because you're at a stage where very little that occurs during these next few weeks matters relative to what happens in January. So I think, they clinch, they can still clinch the division. They can still clinch the bye, but the stakes have been raised. So it's very much to the point of, all right, well, what happens in January?
You know how on Tuesday mornings we get that playoff scenario email from the NFL?
Yes.
I think I've deleted every one of those emails but 3 in 10 years covering the Bears. Or at least ignored them. So I'm glad you guys get to read that email today when it comes out. Figure out what you're clinching. Remember Hoge in 2018? It was like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
Eagles
to
Bears.
Yeah, we get to kind of look at these emails and figure out the Bears clinching scenarios.
Yeah, and they had like a comfortable lead. They clinched the division that year with a couple games to go. Three games to go, I think.
I have a funny Chicago story, by the way, about that game, that Eagles Bears game that I think your listeners might appreciate. And that's it's kind of ironic as the game came down to a kicker. But I was speaking to Jake Elliott, who's a Chicago area native, before that Eagles Bears game, and I'm asking him about kicking in the conditions and going with the whole Windy City theme. And a few minutes in, he's like, by the way, the Windy City nickname is not because of the weather. And I actually did not know that, right? So I think Chicago people can appreciate that. I did not put that together. I was going with the whole, with the whole wind and Chicago conditions, and he had to correct me on that one.
Yeah, remind me, what year did when did Jake come in the league? Because I remember Kevin and I both remember that beat. 17, that's right. Because I remember
the Senior Bowl.
Yeah, that's right. Lions. So he's an LT grad from LaGrange, Lions Township, and coming out of Memphis. I remember because that was after they had already cut Robbie Gould and they needed a kicker, and it was like, hey, they should be looking at Jake Elliott, and then they didn't, and then they ended up with Cody Parkey, and then that just made the whole thing. even worse with the double doink.
Well, it was a short-sighted thing by the Bengals too. The Bengals drafted him in the 5th round and then put him on the practice squad right away. He didn't make the roster, and that's where the Eagles poached him from when their kicker got injured. So they're the ones who really messed up.
Yeah, I forgot he was originally on the Bengals.
We had an Chicago Athletic Philadelphia meetup the night before that game.
That's right. I remember that.
I think more Bo and Shield fans showed up than Athletic Chicago fans.
It's the Shield cronies. They travel in packs. Yeah.
I know Bo has his minions. So,
well, this is pre Adam Jahns at the Athletic because
and pre Zach Berman. Yeah,
that's true. Then we could have really had we could have filled up that bar.
Well, just with his children is what I'm hearing.
Yes. just with the Johns family, exactly. Yeah. All right, well, let's jump into some of the current. I was actually thinking about, before we were jumping on here, about the differences in the Bears and Eagles since our podcast started in 2015, and yeah, they've had one winning season, technically 2 playoff bursts because they did make it as the 7th seed in 2020, but no one here in Chicago even recognizes that happened because they were so bad, and then Manti Te'o started at linebacker in that game.
I don't even remember that.
Yeah, no. People in Chicago don't even remember he was on the team. He was actually on the team the whole year, and no one even knew it because he was on the practice squad. And then Roquan Smith got hurt right before the playoffs, and he actually had to play. It was just a disaster. So, guys, before we get into the quarterback talk, the Eagles, of course, win a Super Bowl, right? And they beat the Bears in the playoffs. They kind of have at least in Chicago, we look at it as a very quick dip of being bad and then flipped it around really fast. How did the Eagles do that so quickly? Because, of course, here in Chicago, finally going into this offseason, the Bears are going to have a ton of cap space, draft capital, all the things that they haven't really had in so many years because they kept mortgaging the future. So they're looking at teams like the Eagles and the Bills for hey, how did they do this, and how can the Bears turn this thing around?
Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, so I would say, big picture, Howie Roseman, the Eagles general manager, is probably best at building or rebuilding. When they were trying to maintain that championship team, there were some moves and some philosophies that backfired on them. But as far as how they did it so quickly, there was a few things. First off, they were willing to eat Carson Wentz's money, which I don't know if some teams would have done that. That was a huge decision. They trade Carson Wentz at the right time before, frankly, his $120+ million contract extension even commenced. They trade him. They get picks for him, valuable picks, but also what they did there was they were able to kind of reset their cap picture and reset their organization. The year prior, they drafted Jalen Hurts in the 2nd round. They didn't draft him with the intention of him becoming the starter, franchise quarterback, MVP candidate, but that turned out to be a good pick, and they've developed him well. But then outside of the quarterback situation, they were very strategic in terms of how they navigated their draft picks. They traded back to add future picks. They had a lot of draft inventory and a lot of flexibility that allowed them to, for instance, trade up to get Devontae Smith. And then this past offseason, they just really executed things well. They were patient. They allowed some signings to come to them, like James Bradbury. But then in addition to that, what you saw them do was they were able to trade for A.J. Brown on draft night. That was a huge move for them. So there was just a collection of moves Howie Roseman was able to do, but it started with the Carson Wentz trade, and then it kind of went from there, tanking the final game of the 2020 season. They wouldn't call it tanking, but that certainly helped in terms of draft picture. Then the last thing I'll say is Jeffrey Lurie and the Eagles front office did a good job in terms of hiring Nick Sirianni, who was an unknown candidate, but turned out to be a really good hire for the Eagles.
Yeah, I think the off seasons, the last 2 off seasons, the way that things have turned around so quickly is a little bit jarring. And I think after the Carson Wentz trade, there was an expectation that it was going to be sort of dark times for a while. Even when Jeffrey Lurie hired Nick Sirianni, the messaging was like, we're getting rid of Doug Peterson because we know we need to rebuild, and that's not fair to Doug. And obviously that was their messaging, but it was like, we are excited about the coach that you can become, because this is going to take some time. And I think what was a pleasant surprise for them last season was their 2018 draft class, which was just like, it was just a 5-player draft class. Those guys all sort of took a jump. And, that includes Jordan Mailata, who was a 7th round pick. Dallas Goedert was able to step into the forefront. Avonte Maddox and Josh Sweat became good, like really good. And that was part of the problem with the Eagles' decline over the course of that post Super Bowl time period, is that they had this sort of gap of no like franchise tenants in their prime, right? They had young players and they had old players. They didn't have anybody in their like mid to late 20s who was really making an impact. And now that 2018 class sort of graduated to that took their roster into better shape last year, and they were able to take advantage of an easy schedule and slide into the playoffs. And then this offseason, that put Howie Roseman into sort of hyperdrive. But there's also some luck involved here, and Zach and I have talked about this a lot. Like, they didn't expect Jalen Hurts to be this good. They tried to trade for Russell Wilson. They looked into Deshaun Watson. Before they got A.J. Brown, they tried to sign Allen Robinson. They looked into signing Christian Kirk. They tried to trade for Calvin Ridley. And so there's like a sliding doors where we're talking about like a terrible Eagles team with Russell Wilson and Allen Robinson, as opposed to them being a little bit fortunate that this is the way that things have played out. And boy, have they.
See, Hoge, I think when I listen to that, I've always thought that Howie Roseman could be the GM Ryan Poles wants to emulate a little bit in terms of roster building, because you hear Bo and Zach talk about a lot of these players came from the draft, and then they use that draft capital to put themselves in position to get an AJ Brown, as opposed to, I know you guys said that they looked into a Christian Kirk and Allen Robinson, but like I feel like that's where, when we look ahead of the next draft, that's where I'm so interested to see what Ryan Poles does, because we're going to have this debate. It's going to be a very annoying debate for 4 months about whether the Bears should stay at 2 or 3 or trade back. And I feel like Howie Roseman would be the type of guy that would trade back. And we saw what Philadelphia did with those picks, because you look at what the Eagles had as a foundation, and I think it's a lot more than what the Bears might have. Like, I just feel like the Bears still have a couple more drafts potentially to go to get there. And I wonder if he looks at Howie Roseman as a GM that he wants to kind of be like when it comes to how to wheel and deal in the draft.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, refresh our memory. How many they traded back in the first round 2 years in a row, or was it even more than that?
Yeah. So in 2021, after they had lost that final game of the regular season, they traded out of number 6 early, in like a few weeks before the draft, and down to number 12, and picked up a Dolphins first round pick. And then they ended up moving up a couple spots to draft Devontae Smith. And then last year they had 3 first round picks. And so they traded one of them, or I guess what was it, Zach? They traded 2 of them to the Saints. And then one of them to the Saints.
They traded one for a future first, future second,
first, and a future second. And then they ended up moving up with one of them for Jordan Davis, and they traded the other one for AJ Brown.
Oh, I forgot about the Saints and their role in all of this.
Yeah, which is why now
there's going to be 3 teams in the top 5 who have all lost their picks.
It's crazy, and so as it stands right now, and this still could change a lot, but the Eagles are the best team in football with the 5th overall pick in the NFL draft coming up. So I mean, that all sounds like a dream.
I would just say, as Bo mentioned there, a lot of this was designed to position themselves to get a quarterback, right? All the draft picks, all the cap space, and then Jalen Hurts becoming this quarterback really helps the roster building overall.
Well, and that is one parallel, right, with the Bears, is that, for all of Ryan Pace's faults in Chicago and Matt Nagy's, it does at least seem like right now you can feel optimistic that they left the new regime at quarterback based on what we've seen so far. We'll get into that in a second, but I've heard the tanking thing now multiple times, including yesterday. It came up once. What happened in that last game then in 2020 because as you can imagine, there's a huge story in Chicago right now. Like at this point, now that they played the
They should
Packers
lose,
again,
right.
Bears fans just want the Bears to lose out at this point to make sure they secure a top 3, maybe a top 2 pick. So what did the Eagles actually do in that last game that it actually looked like, oh, they're actually intentionally losing this game?
Bill?
Well, it was interesting because there was a spotlight placed on the game because it was the final game of the season. It was that Sunday night game. They had flexed into it because the Washington football team was like the only team in a win and in scenario. It really wasn't that wild from my perspective. What made it a little bit wonky is that Jalen Hurts played the first half, and then I think with the first drive of the second half, and then they pulled him for Nate Sudfeld. And, Doug Peterson's messaging after the game was like, well, Nate's been such a good soldier for us. We wanted to get him some playing time. And so that made it look a little bit untoward, but it really wasn't that crazy of a thing to me. I think there was a little bit too much made of it because it was the primetime game. That said, I sort of get it. But it also totally worked out in the Eagles' favor. It also they weren't necessarily going to win that game anyway. Jalen Hurts was playing very poorly. So it's not like they lost intentionally and let the football team score. It was just the pulling of the quarterback is really what made it sort of everybody's sirens go up.
Yeah, the other thing is they didn't even dress their full allotment of players, right? So any player who had any type of injury, particularly veteran guys, just didn't play at all, which isn't abnormal when it's a bad team and in the last game of the year, but they were very I don't want to say brazen, but apparent in just playing a lot of guys who fans might not remember. Number one, but to Bo's point, and this is the thing that was kind of lost in everything is they were 4-10-1 with their best players. Right. They weren't a good team that year as it was. So it's not as if they took the 72 Dolphins or the 85 Bears and all of a sudden sat everybody. They were a bad team in a bad division in a really bad year. And they were just trying to get to the finish line as fast as they could. But taking out their starting quarterback in the middle of the game to put in Nate Sudfeld became a national punchline.
Can you imagine, Hoge, if week 18 they'd yank Justin Fields at halftime for Nathan Peterman?
It would go against everything that Matt Eberflus has talked about this year. It sounds like the one parallel that cannot be drawn between the two teams because if
I was going to say, and Bo and Zach could correct me, I don't know, and this is where draft cachet comes in play. Jalen Hurts, as you guys said, second round pick. Justin Fields, the guy they trade up for in the first round, and I don't know. I'm thinking back to late 2020. In that game, it wasn't like all of Philadelphia knew Jalen Hurts was the guy.
Definitely not.
Right.
Yeah.
So in Chicago, at least Chicago Bears fans are all in on Fields right now. So it's a little different. But and I've mentioned this on the pod before, but as a fan of chaos, I want the week 18 scenario where the Bears have to lose to get the number 2 pick, and the Vikings playoff seed is locked in, and they're playing their backups. And what's going to happen?
That's good. I would also imagine that because it's Eberflus's first year, there's sort of a culture building angle to it that you can't just lose a game on purpose. Whereas Doug Peterson was playing out the string with this Super Bowl roster that was all sort of tired of this whole thing.
And the difference, I believe, was between the 9 pick and the 6 pick. I'm not positive on the 9, but they end up with the 6 pick, and that positioned them to be a part of that Dolphins 49ers trade. So they were able to get a future first out of it. They were able to get more draft inventory out of it that they wouldn't have been able to do had they been drafting at number 9.
Yeah, it's interesting. And there's one connection that we're live on YouTube today, and one of our commenters, Brian Schuster, said, I wonder how much Ian Cunningham was involved in all that. Bears assistant GM who came from Philadelphia. Whether he was involved in it or not, he certainly witnessed it and was a part of all the fallout from it and some of the trades that put the Eagles in the position that they're in. And obviously, yeah, the big thing in all this is that Jalen Hurts became Jalen Hurts, and even to the Eagles' surprise. What happened last year that because I know the Eagles went through something similar as the Bears did this year with Justin Fields, where they sort of shifted their offense to tailor it more towards what Jalen Hurts did well at the time. And then it seems like this year they kind of took that next step to allow Jalen Hurts to become more of the passer. But kind of walk us through all that going back to last season, because the Bears went through this mini bye earlier this year, and they came out of it on that Monday night game against the Patriots, and it was like a completely different offense for Justin Fields, and it's really paid off.
So similar to the Chicago situation, Nick Sirianni was hired for what can be categorized as an arranged marriage. It wasn't a situation where the coach comes in and picks his quarterback. The difference, of course, is Fields is a number one pick or a first-round pick, and Hurts, he didn't necessarily have the same organizational commitment when Sirianni came in. But I bring that up as a way of saying it wasn't like Sirianni picked the quarterback for his offense. So when they started last season, they were much more of a pass-heavy offense. They were running basically the Phillip Rivers offense with RPOs in it, right? And then I think around midseason, excuse me, they saw what they did well. They saw what they didn't do well, and they shifted to more of a run-oriented offense. It fit Hurts. They had a really good offensive line. That obviously helped. And, you know, there was changes in play calling during that too. They shifted from Nick Sirianni to Shane Steichen, but it was still the same offensive philosophy. It was just they became more run-heavy. And then as Hurts improved and as they got more weapons, that was the other thing too. They really didn't have good wide receivers last year other than Devontae Smith, and Quez Watkins was still developing. So as their weapons improved this year, as Jalen Hurts improved, then you saw the whole offense come together, and they had a full off season, which they didn't have a year ago, obviously. So I look at those variables, but the main thing is they looked at the players they had and they built their offense or adjusted their offense to their players, as opposed to keep saying to Jalen Hurts, you have to play this way.
Yeah, I think there are two big things about the leap that Jalen Hurts has made this season. One that makes total sense, and one that has sort of changed my mind and converted me into believing in stuff that I may not have believed in before. The latter is Jalen Hurts has turned me into an intangibles guy. I would have always said that stuff is a little bit overrated. And, everything you heard last offseason from the Eagles was, we don't know what this guy's ceiling is, but we feel very confident that whatever it is, he's going to hit it. And you talk to everybody around him, everybody in the locker room, you watch the way that he goes about things. I really believe that he is wired in a way where he is just pathologically obsessed with the process of getting better at football. And so I think that matters. And I also I would have said that the second year in a system thing, who knows how, it's so undefinable. How much does that really matter? But Jalen Hurts hadn't played in the same offensive system for the same play caller since high school in 2 years in a row. And so this is his first time doing that since then. And I think you can tell that there's a difference being made just in terms of his comfort. And he's made, leaps in terms of pre-snap checks and knowing where his hot routes are and stuff like that. So I think that stuff is it's been a little bit murky and changed my mind about how much that stuff matters. And then the other thing is what Zach said. I would have always said that if you want to really make a quarterback better, you got to give him weapons and guys who are going to make him better. And I think AJ Brown is so good that he is. I think the elite receivers are independent variables that they can lift quarterbacks to higher levels. And AJ Brown, even in the specific ways that he's good, help in ways that Jalen Hurts was not great last year, throwing over the middle of the field. His deep ball has gotten a lot better. I think if I'm looking at what can the Bears do to follow the Jalen Hurts path, I would imagine it is give him somebody he's comfortable with as the play caller and get him some real weapons to throw to. And I'm sure that's part of the reason they traded that second round pick for Chase Claypool. I'm sure he's not quite on AJ Brown's level, but I think that seems like the thing that they're trying to do.
Yeah, I was going to say Darnell Mooney, Chase Claypool to Devontae Smith, AJ Brown. There's a slight gap there. Folks should check out a story up on The Athletic that Zach pitched in for, was kind of looking at these questions and including the Bills too, because how lucky are the Bears that after they play the Eagles, they get to welcome the Bills to Soldier Field. And it's a similar spot where Josh Allen was really bad as a rookie and had this amazing unicorn-like improvement. And then Brandon Beane builds around and they go out and get Stephon Diggs. They use their draft picks wisely, and now they're a juggernaut. But listening to Bo and Zach talk about the receivers and the offensive line, Hoge, that's where it's like, how did the Bears get these guys, right? Because you mentioned Malatz has become this good player. You already had Lane Johnson, Jason Kelsey. Like right now, the Bears might have somebody in Tevin Jenkins, and that's about it in terms of like guys you could say, hey, they're going to be long-term fixtures in this offensive line. And I'll always wonder this too. And you guys, Bo and Zach, went through this as the Eagles were trying to figure out how do we find that other wide receiver. Is there was a period of time when A.J. Brown, Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, and Deebo Samuel all looked like they were going to play out this season and be available via trade next year. And all of them, well, A.J. Brown got traded, and the other guys all signed extensions.
Mm-hmm.
And that left Ryan Poles in a situation where he looked at the wide receiver class, and Poles has talked about this, like that Chase Claypool is pretty much the best guy he could get at this point. Now, maybe I can't even think. I mean, is there a wide receiver that come March or April is going to be upset where he is, and the Bears can go
Probably.
get him? Yeah, they'll probably be. That's the position. There'll probably be somebody, but I think it's just like
It might be Chase Claypool.
Chase Claypool. Yeah, we'll see how these last 4 games go. But it's just all these are just a reminder that the Eagles. I think that the biggest similarity that the Bears and Eagles can see is this quarterback improvement, right? Because that's something Justin Fields can control. That's something he can do. And now the next step is, okay, how can he continue that? And then what can Ryan Poles bring in around him? And it's going to be very tough for Poles to find the strike the luck that Howie Roseman's gotten with who's around Hurts.
Well, the part with the offensive line, it's like the expression, show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value, right? If you look at how the Eagles spend their draft picks, and it's a running joke in Philadelphia that they're drafting offensive linemen and defensive linemen all the time, right? Their second round picks last year, the last 2 seasons were interior offensive linemen, neither one with the intention of starting from week 1, and it was for long term, right? They always and this is something Howie Roseman talks about, is they'll always break a tie by going with an offensive lineman. There's a reason why they haven't drafted a linebacker in the first round since 1979. There's a reason why they keep going through running backs and linebackers and to a certain extent safeties. And they're draft. They have good offensive line in part because they have a really good offensive line coach, and they developed players, but also because they prioritize this. They draft it, they develop it, they pay money to it. So if you want to see, the Eagles are an open book test, in my opinion. If you want to see how they build their roster, look at how they spend their money and look at how they spend their draft picks.
Hey,
Which was so surprising about the Bears draft class last year. You've got an offensive line general manager, an offensive line assistant GM, and it's 2 secondary guys in the second round and a 35-year-old wide receiver return specialist in the third round.
Hey, the Bears drafted 4 offensive linemen. How dare you? They might have all been after the 5th round.
Yes, and only one of them plays. One's on the Rams now, I think.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
But they did go out and they got Alex Leatherwood off waivers. They're trying to take flyers with what they had, and they really were limited in the early draft capital that they had. He managed to add a lot more late, which is pretty much all he could do. But I do think there's a story here involving Kyle Long and Chris Long going back to that 2018 playoff game that always sticks in my head, because Kyle told this story after that game a little bit later, but there's sort of this assumption that had Cody Parkey's kick gone in, the Bears were going to go on this like magical run because they had already beaten the Rams, who they would have played the next week, blah, blah, blah. And so Kyle was doing an interview and he was asked, do you think that you guys would have kept going? And he said that his brother Chris, who of course was on the Eagles, he had actually asked Chris that same question. He said, hey, you think if that kick goes in that we could have gone on to win the Super Bowl? And Chris told him flat out no. He said, you guys weren't physical enough.
Mm-hmm.
He said, just as a line. And so I think that, and that's probably why in that game where the Bears may have had the more talent overall in the roster up front, the Eagles were the more physical team. And I think that that's just something that in general, the Bears, because we ended up talking about that for a couple seasons after. They just weren't physical enough at the line of scrimmage. And I do think that Ryan Poles, Ian Cunningham, that's one of their emphasis that they are fixing now, or trying to fix. That being said, the Bears team you see this weekend, guys, if the Eagles have the best defensive line in football, which I think Sam Mustipher said yesterday about the Eagles, the Bears have by far the worst. Like they almost like don't have a D line. They don't get sacks, they don't get pressure, and it's just like when you look at this matchup at the line of scrimmage, it really shouldn't be that close.
Well, that explains why the Eagles gave a 4th-round pick for supposedly the Bears' best pass rusher, and he has been a complete dud and is now on IR. Yeah, I mean, I think the Eagles' defensive line is very deep. I think that's what makes it good, is that they can keep guys fresh. You've got Fletcher Cox and Javon Hargrave in the middle, but also now Linval Joseph and Milton Williams and Ndamukong Suh and Jordan Davis, their 1st-round pick, who's barely playing right now after returning from injured reserve. And then you've got Hassan Reddick and Josh Sweat on the edge, Brandon Graham, who's coming off a 3-sack game. So they got a lot of bodies to throw at you. And I think that right now they're 1st in the league in sacks. They've got 1 more sack than the Cowboys. I think the Cowboys pass rush is probably like a little bit more scary. And maybe that you could argue the Niners too, but what makes the Eagles pass rush and defensive line so good is that they're so deep. They can keep guys fresh, and that goes to what Zach said about organizational philosophy and what they spend on. That is what they value.
My number one question about the game ahead is how many points will the Eagles score? Because I was doing this thought exercise, and they scored 48 on the road against the Giants, or
like a very easy 48.
Yeah. So here they come to play the Bears. Now, here's a question, though. If it's, let's say it's 35-14 heading into the 4th quarter, you look ahead to the following week, the Eagles have the Cowboys. That's game of the year, right? And or
short
is it,
week. Yeah.
Or I mean, it's a 2-game lead, so maybe they can kind of.
If they win the other 3 games, they don't need that game. But you don't know if you're going to win those last 2.
So does Nick Sirianni dial it back a little bit? He and Matty Rufus used to work together. I know this is more of a college football thing that you wonder about than a pros, but I just I was watching some of the Eagles game last week. I'm thinking, oh my God, they might score 60 when they come to Soldier Field.
So I know a Saturday game is not the same as a Thursday game, but anecdotally, when the Eagles had a short week last time, so they pulled their starters in the 4th quarter of the Sunday game with a big
very
lead.
Early, yeah.
And then in the locker room after the game, they're literally doing recovery stuff. They have stationary bikes set up. They have they're very mindful of the recovery aspect of it. In November and December, they stop practicing on Wednesdays. They just do walkthroughs. So my guess is if the Eagles have a healthy lead in Sunday's game, knowing that they have 1 fewer day of recovery, knowing that, the importance of the Dallas game, the fact that there's a lot of travel baked in here, flying back from Chicago, flying to Dallas, they're mindful of those elements. So I would be surprised if Jalen Hurts is playing deep into the 4th quarter if they have a lead.
One thing I'm curious about on the Bears side going into this game, guys, that you might want to keep an eye on is, the Bears obviously aren't that good, but when they had that mini bye, and I mentioned this earlier, they really got together as a coaching staff and made, changes that needed to be made with sort of the future in mind and getting the most that they could. And I just wonder what kind of wrinkles there might be, maybe different players that get more of an opportunity. I'm not saying it's anything that'll, flip the game or anything in the way that it was against the Patriots in that Monday nighter earlier in the season. The Bears defense isn't anywhere near as good as it was back then with some of the moves and injuries that they've had, but just something to keep in mind. There could be some different players in different places, different, do they make more of an emphasis to get Chase Claypool involved at this point, downfield passing, Field still's dealing with that shoulder. I'm assuming it's not 100%. Maybe won't be until the end of the season, although the bye week probably helped with that. Just something to think about. I wanted to ask you guys, too, obviously with that Cowboys game coming up, the NFC is just an interesting conference. Like, who are the Eagles afraid of right now? It's weird. Like, the Lions are almost like the tricky team you don't want to see in the playoffs all of a sudden if they could sneak in, because like you look at it right now, they might be the fourth best team in the whole conference.
Yeah, I think
that's right.
In a 1-game season, which is what you talked about in the playoffs, I still think Dallas and San Francisco present challenges, and San Francisco, even with Brock Purdy in there, we saw what they did last week. That defense is outstanding, and there's I'm not going to doubt Jalen Hurts right now, because he's answered the bell every game this year. He's done everything that they expect, but like the one thing we haven't really seen this year is what happens when Jalen Hurts has an off game, because he hasn't really had an off game. He's had some games that are worse than other games, but even when they lost to Washington, I mean, they had untimely fumbles, not from Jalen Hurts, from your skill guys. So until Jalen Hurts had a really bad playoff game last year in Tampa Bay, he's a much better quarterback now than he was then. So I don't even want to compare that Jalen Hurts to this Jalen Hurts. But when you see a really good defense like San Francisco is, like Dallas is, then you just wonder, what's the team's second plan B if Jalen Hurts is not playing like Jalen Hurts that day.
Zach always likes to say, what's the fourth paragraph when someone pitches him a story? Like, I think that's like what you're saying is what happens after the initial head to head. I think what's been so impressive about this Eagles season is that they have shown that they can win in so many different ways. Against the Packers a couple weeks ago, they ran for 300 yards, right? And then they followed that up by Jalen Hurts throwing for 380 yards the next week. And then last week, they like threw it all over the field in the first half and then ran for like 180 yards in the second half. They can do so many different things on offense, and their one big Achilles heel on defense was stopping the run. And over the last 3 weeks, like with Linval Joseph signed, that has sort of been plugged. So they seem to have answers to all the questions, but that doesn't mean that they can't, have a bad turnover game, some bad fumble luck here and there in the playoffs. I think I agree with you that I think the Lions would be the team I would rank third. I would probably say that San Francisco is the team that would scare me the most, just because their defense scares me a little bit more. I think they match up better with the Eagles, and because the running game is something that has worried the Eagles in the past, I think their variety on the ground is something that could give them a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah, the reason I don't say Detroit is because in these situations, any team, they need to come to Philadelphia in mid-January, and that is
Jared Goff doesn't scare you.
Yeah, I mean, I think a team that can run the ball and has a really good defense is what would pull off the upset more than a team that can throw the ball all over the field against them.
Yeah, and that's not the Lions with that defense. Although they kind of hung it. That week one was a long time ago, but that was the matchup in week one, and they refresh my memory. Weren't the Eagles winning by a lot, and the Lions came back?
The Lions jumped out to a lead, and then the Eagles came back and were up 2 scores. But then the Lions got the ball down 3 points, and the Eagles stopped them at the end of the game.
And meanwhile, the Bears beat the 49ers that day. So probably a good lesson to not look too much at what happened in week one for a game then that could be played in mid-January. Guys, appreciate you guys doing this. It's awesome. It's a lot of fun. Bo Wulf, Zach Berman, all these guys here, Kevin filling in for Johns. Make sure you're checking out all their work on The Athletic. Some really good stuff, as always. And Birds with Friends is the podcast that they do. I know I'll be listening to that this week. Make sure you check it out. Follow Zach on Twitter @ZBerm. Follow Bo @Bo_Wulf. That's WULF. And Kevin, of course, @KFishbain. Also, thanks to Marissa Dunn for filling in for Kent on this one as our producer. And we'll be back, Kevin, on Thursday for our preview episode as we jump into this even more so this game against the Eagles. So we'll be back on our regularly scheduled Thursday preview show then. Bo, Zach, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, that's going to do it for us. We'll see you Thursday.